Hey guys, welcome to Arcran's Arcanum. Today we're continuing our series where we talk about how to run the game for different classes, this time for monks. We're going to go over what you can expect from the class, as well as give some tips and tricks for building interesting encounters and scenarios for the class. With that, let's get started. Right out the gate, monks have a pretty different feel from the other D&D classes. They don't really rely on weapons, armor, or spells, and while they get a lot of features, most of them are kind of niche and aren't always going to be helpful. Fortunately, there's a handful of core monk features that they get early on that, if you understand them, you'll know what to expect from your monk almost all of the time. The first two abilities to understand are Unarmored Defense and Martial Arts. Unarmored Defense is just why monks don't need to bother with armor. It changes their armor class calculation to be equal to 10 plus their Dexterity modifier plus their Wisdom modifier. Keep in mind that this isn't a bonus to armor class, it's a new equation, so it doesn't stack with things like mage armor or a lizard folk's natural armor, for example. As a general rule of thumb, if at low levels your monk has a higher AC than 15 or 16, you might want to double check your math because that's what you should generally expect at those levels. Martial arts is what lets monks somewhat ignore weapons and really lets them ignore strength. It lets them use their dexterity modifier instead of their strength modifier for all unarmed attacks as well as attacks with melee monk weapons, and in addition it'll scale up the damage of those attacks depending on the monk's level. The big benefit here though is that it lets monks make a single unarmed strike as a bonus action, so long as they took the attack action and that attack action involved at least one unarmed strike or melee monk weapon attack. This is something that will happen a lot for your monk, so you should expect every time they take the attack action, they're going to get one extra unarmed strike. This is going to be especially potent early on because your monk will have access to 2 attacks when every other class only has 1. Unarmored movement is another monk ability and one that's pretty quick to cover. As long as your monk's not wearing armor, they get to move a lot faster and they get a big bonus to their speed. At level 9, this gets upgraded even more and it lets them run along liquids as well as along vertical surfaces on their turn. The only thing to note here is that when your monk's turn is over, they'll fall like a normal person, and that's something you're going to want to make sure they know in advance, otherwise it could be a very nasty surprise for them. Ki is the main resource for the monk class and is what they spend to use a lot of their more interesting and more powerful abilities. Early on, your players will have access to 3 Ki abilities: Flurry of Blows, Patient Defense, and Step of the Wind. Flurry of Blows is an offensive tool that, after taking the attack action, your player can spend a Ki and use a bonus action to make 2 more unarmed attacks. This is going to show up a lot early because making 3 attacks at low levels is really powerful, and in my experience, players like to make attacks. Patient Defense is pretty simple. As a bonus action, your player can spend a Ki to take the dodge action, which makes them harder to hit for a turn, which can be really helpful depending on the current state of the battle. And Step of the Wind is a really powerful mobility tool that lets them either dash or disengage as a bonus action after spending a Ki, and it also triples their jumping movement, which means this one actually might show up outside of combat. The only thing to keep in mind for this is all 3 of these abilities are bonus actions, so make sure your player isn't trying to take multiple bonus actions just because when you're spending Ki, sometimes that gets jumbled up. The Ki ability that'll probably have the biggest impact on your encounters comes at level 5, Stunning Strike. After hitting with a melee attack, your monk can spend a Ki to force the target to make a Constitution saving throw. If they fail that save, they're stunned until the end of the monk's next turn, which is probably one of the nastiest conditions in 5th edition. It essentially means that the target misses their next turn, all attacks against them have advantage, and they automatically fail all strength and dexterity saving throws, which means not only do they not get to do anything, there's also a very good chance that they will just die. This can have a huge impact on the balance of your encounter if your monk stuns the right enemy, so we're going to talk about how to balance around this later in the video. With that, we've covered most of the core monk abilities, and we're going to move into more how to build your encounters and build your adventuring days around the abilities of your monk. The first thing we need to talk about when talking about how to run the game for monks is resting. Ki comes back on a short rest, so the number of short rests your monk gets is very important. If they don't get enough, they can't afford to use their abilities, and if they get too many, they can use all of their Ki in one fight, which makes them really powerful. In an ideal world, I would recommend 2 combat encounters per short rest. And the reason I specify combat encounters is that monks don't really have many ways to spend their Ki outside of combat. If they're a subclass like Way of the Shadow that introduces ways for them to use their Ki outside of combat, you can probably get away with 1 combat encounter and 1 out of combat encounter that will force them to spend Ki. The idea here though is that you don't want your monk to ever be using more than half of their ki in a single encounter unless they intentionally save it for later. Monks are in a bit of an odd spot in combat. Because they have so many abilities that trigger off melee attacks, they're clearly meant to be on the front lines. The problem is they only have a d8 hit die, which means they won't have a ton of hit points, and while unarmored defense provides a good AC, it's not going to be very high until your monk has really high stats. In addition, smart enemies might look at the heavily armored fighter and the guy in a robe and decide the guy in the robe is going to be a lot easier to hit, so smart enemies might prioritize the monk. Because of this, monks shouldn't look particularly sturdy to you, and that's true. You should expect your monk player to be using their mobility and their ability to disengage as a bonus action to stay away from any dangerous spots on the battlefield and surviving that way. If your monk is ever right in the middle of the fight, that could be a bad time for them, and when you're building encounters, if you want a really challenging one, make it so your monk doesn't have as many mobility options. Another thing to keep in mind about monks is the number of weird defensive options they have. By level 10, a monk is either immune to or somehow resistant to fall damage, ranged attacks, the charmed and frightened conditions, all dexterity saving throws, as well as poison and disease. Once monks get these immunities, a lot of DMs, almost unconsciously, stop using these abilities against the monk because, after all, it's going to waste a turn, so why do it? The problem with this is that while you as the DM know that the monk is immune to these things, the enemy probably doesn't, and if you don't target the monk with these effects, you devalue their abilities. Make sure you keep hitting them with those things. Put archers in counters so your monk can use deflect missiles. Make sure you keep hitting them with dexterity saving throws so they can effortlessly dodge with evasion. You want your monk to be able to use these niche abilities because they feel really valuable and really powerful when they trigger. In terms of damage, monks are on the lower side. While they get a lot of attacks, the individual damage of each attack tends to be low. However, they can inflict the stun condition, which makes them potentially the most dangerous class for a one-on-one encounter. Because stunned is so powerful, you need to be especially conscious of Stunning Strike when you're building your boss fights, so let's go over some guiding principles that you can use to make sure Stunning Strike doesn't trivialize your boss fight, while still making it useful. The first thing to keep in mind is just following the encounter guidelines I gave earlier in this video. In theory, there should be at least one combat encounter leading up to the boss fight, and no opportunity to rest in between them. This means that your monk has probably already spent some of their ki, and they can't be as reckless with it, like dumping all of it into trying to stun the boss. It's a pretty easy fix, but one that'll pay off really well for you. The next piece of advice is also just a good encounter building guideline. Always make sure that there are multiple enemies. If your party's fighting a single enemy, it's really easy for it to get stunned and completely trivialize the fight. If there's multiple enemies, one getting stunned still helps, but it doesn't end the encounter in the same way. If you want a single enemy to be able to challenge your party, look up legendary actions and legendary resistances, because without those, your monk will end the fight before it even starts. Simply following those two tips will make sure that no encounters get trivialized by Stunning Strike. But there's one more thing we can do to make sure our monk feels useful, while still preserving the balance of our fights: adding enemies that we expect to be stunned. To do this, add a threatening enemy that your monk will expect to have a low constitution score, typically a spellcaster because that's kind of how they work. In general, your monk will prioritize shutting down these targets, saving your boss from Stunning Strike, while still making your monk very valuable and very useful. Monks are an incredibly mobile class and are going to excel in encounters that reward this, such as a larger battlefield or a fight with specific objectives the party needs to reach. Compared to other mobile classes like rogues, monks do have a few tools specifically with their vertical mobility. With Step of the Wind, they can triple their jumping distance, which lets them get up to high places very easily, and with Slowfall, they can basically ignore fall damage, which lets them occasionally get to interesting locations that other classes would take a lot of damage if they went to. When you're thinking of objectives, try to think of ways that you can include the monk's better jumping ability, as well as their ability to ignore fall damage to make objectives that only the monk can reach and let them contribute. Unfortunately, until higher levels, most monks don't have access to a lot of out-of-combat utility. Because of this, be a little bit more flexible when they want to use a skill in an interesting way. If they want to try to disarm a dart trap by just using deflect missiles until it runs out of ammo, sure. Of course, the simplest scenario that will always make your monk feel valuable is any time the party does not have access to their gear or anything like that. If the fighter doesn't have his sword and the wizard doesn't have their wand, they're way weaker than normal, but the monk without access to their gear is still pretty much a monk and almost all of their abilities still work. If you want to challenge a monk, anything that punishes melee combat, such as the spell Fire Shield or a Remoraz, will give them a hard time. A lot of their best abilities key off of melee attacks, so if they don't have access to them, they're going to struggle. In addition, creatures with a high constitution save can be difficult because they're going to be much harder to stun. As a general note, not many creatures are naturally immune to stun, which implies that it's not meant to be a common immunity. Don't overuse this in your game, otherwise your monk's most powerful ability suddenly becomes worthless. And with that, you should have a good idea about how the typical monk works and what you should do to challenge them and reward their abilities. Now I'm going to briefly go over the subclasses, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to touch on their abilities that really change how the monk plays, as well as only talk about the official subclasses, so no Unearthed Arcana and no homebrew. First up is Way of the Open Hand. Their open hand technique ability makes Flurry of Blows a little bit better by letting monks try to prone, push, or remove reactions from enemies that they hit with their Flurry of Blows. Because of this, you want to try to add hazards on the battlefield so that when your monk uses the push option, they can try to shove enemies into like pits or spikes or something so they have an interesting way to use that ability and interact with the battlefield. Way of Shadow Monk is the one that probably requires the most work from you as the DM because their level 6 ability, Shadow Step, makes you care about the lighting in your game. Normally DMs kind of ignore this with just a it's dark or it's not dark, but Shadow Step specifically requires dim light or darkness, which mechanically means it either has to be dark enough that you have disadvantage on perception or dark enough that you're blind. Now, this is a little bit hard to define, so in general, I would recommend just deciding at the start, this battlefield is dim light or this battlefield is not dim light, and just go from there. If you want to get more complicated, you can mark out specifically where light sources are, but that gets into a lot of work and there's not a lot of payoff for it. In general, just let your Shadow Monk use their Shadow Step ability. It's the best part of the subclass and the most interesting thing, so make sure it's able to show up a lot. In addition, their Shadow Arts ability will give them a little bit more out of combat utility than most of the other monk subclasses. Way of the Four Elements is hard to broadly define simply because depending on the elemental disciplines picked, it can vary a lot from monk to monk. In general, try to make sure that elemental attunement can solve some problems outside of combat every once in a while, and in addition, look at the elemental disciplines picked by your monk and try to come up with combat scenarios that will reward those disciplines in interesting ways. Way of the Long Death makes your monk much more durable, but doesn't really change how the class plays. Hour of Reaping is actually allowed to be used outside of combat, so make sure your monk knows that for when they need to intimidate somebody. Way of the Drunken Master makes the monk much more mobile through Drunken Technique, as the monk can still attack while getting some free disengages. Expect a more mobile and evasive monk, but not many changes to their core gameplay. Way of the Kenside changes very little about the monk besides letting them deal a bit more damage, and also giving them the opportunity to have a bit more AC. The only thing to note here is that these monks are also strong at range, so it makes them a bit more versatile than the other subclasses. In a similar vein, Way of the Sun Soul also has a built-in ranged attack, and they won't struggle at range as much as the other monks either. In addition, they also get a couple of built-in area of effect attacks that will let them deal with groups better than other monks, so if you have a Way of the Sun Soul monk in your party, try to add in a few more groups of weak enemies so they can really show off their abilities. At this point, you should have a good idea of the monk's abilities, as well as what you can do to challenge your monk, as well as let them shine in encounters. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments, and give me a recommendation on what class to cover next. Otherwise, thanks for stopping by the Arcanum, and have a good day.